The afternoon train pulled into Silver Creek Depot in a cloud of steam and dust, and Eleanor Price stood on the platform clutching her travel bag with both hands, watching the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered, as small towns always seem to gather, to witness the arrival of the mail-order bride everyone in Silver Creek had been gossiping about for weeks. She had traveled nearly 400 miles by train and stagecoach to reach this dusty stretch of Montana, carrying with her a bundle of letters exchanged over the better part of a year with a rancher named Thomas Kane, letters that had promised her a fresh start after the particular hardship of her circumstances back east, where a fire had taken her family's modest boarding house and, along with it, most of what remained of her prospects in a town that had already, before the fire, considered her too plain and too poor to attract much serious interest from the men who might otherwise have married her. She was not, by the standards that mattered most in that unforgiving corner of the world, a conventionally pretty woman. Her face carried a faint scarring along one cheek and temple, the legacy of the same fire that had taken her family's livelihood, and her frame was thin and work-worn rather than soft in the ways fashionable ladies' magazines suggested a woman ought to be. She had known, corresponding with Thomas Kane over those many months, that she was taking something of a risk in not mentioning the scarring directly in her letters, though she had described herself honestly in every other particular. Her age, her circumstances, her willingness to work hard and raise children not her own. She had told herself, on the long journey west, that a man who had written to her with such evident loneliness and such careful, thoughtful questions about her character could not possibly be the sort to reject a woman over a scar she had not chosen and could not help. The man waiting for her on the platform, however, was not Thomas Kane. It was Thomas's older brother, Reginald, a man considerably more concerned with appearances than his brother had ever been, and it was Reginald who had, in fact, been intercepting and answering half of Thomas's correspondence in recent months, believing, in his own misguided way, that he was helping his younger brother make a prudent match while Thomas himself was occupied with the demanding work of the ranch. When Eleanor stepped down from the train and Reginald got his first look at her face in the harsh afternoon light, his expression shifted, quick and unmistakable, into something Eleanor recognized immediately, having seen it cross too many faces back home to mistake it for anything else. He said, loud enough for the gathered onlookers to hear, that there had clearly been some manner of mistake, that this could not possibly be the woman his brother had been corresponding with, and he made no effort at all to soften the cruelty of turning a woman away, in front of half the town, on the grounds of her appearance alone. Eleanor stood on that platform with her carpetbag still clutched in both hands, the heat rising in her face, understanding with a sick, familiar certainty that she had traveled 400 miles into precisely the kind of humiliation she had hoped, against her own better judgment, that this new life might finally spare her. She did not cry, though the effort of not crying cost her something considerable, standing there in front of strangers who whispered behind gloved hands and did not trouble themselves to whisper quietly. It was in the middle of this humiliation, with Reginald already turning to instruct someone to see about arranging her return passage, that a second man stepped forward from beneath the depot's wooden awning, a man Eleanor had not previously noticed among the small crowd, tall and weathered, with two young girls, perhaps 6 years old, peering out shyly from behind a wooden post nearby. His name, as it turned out, was Caleb Whitfield, a rancher with a small spread a few miles outside town and a widower these past 2 years, raising his twin daughters, Mary and Grace, largely alone with the occasional help of a neighboring family. He had come to the depot that afternoon for an entirely unrelated errand, collecting a shipment of seed grain that had arrived on the same train, and had found himself, along with everyone else on that platform, an unwilling witness to Reginald Kane's public cruelty. What struck him, watching the scene unfold, was not Eleanor's scarred cheek, which he registered only in passing, but the particular dignity with which she stood there absorbing the humiliation, refusing to give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of watching her crumble, her spine straight and her chin level even as her hands, he noticed, trembled slightly around the handle of her travel bag. Caleb was not, by nature, a man given to grand public gestures, and what he did next surprised him nearly as much as it surprised everyone else on that platform. He crossed the boards toward Eleanor, removed his hat in the manner his mother had taught him decades before, and said, quietly enough that it was meant for her alone, though the stillness of the shocked crowd carried his words further than he'd intended, that his daughters had been asking for the better part of 2 years now when they might have a mother again, and that he did not know a single thing about Eleanor Price beyond what he had just witnessed. but that what he had witnessed told him more about her character than any letter or any face ever could. He asked her plainly whether she would consider staying in Silver Creek regardless of what had just happened with the Kane family, whether she might be willing to let a stranger and his 2 daughters get to know her properly, without any promise attached beyond the chance to see whether something good might grow from such an unlikely beginning. Eleanor, still reeling from the shock of Reginald's rejection, did not answer immediately. She studied Caleb's face for a long moment, searching it for the particular pity or performative kindness she had learned, over years of similar smaller humiliations, to distrust deeply, and found instead something steadier, an honest, uncomplicated directness that seemed to have nothing to do with rescuing her and everything to do with a genuine, practical need that his daughter's quiet, hopeful faces, still peering out from behind the post, made entirely plain. She looked past Caleb toward the 2 girls, and something in the way they watched her, cautious but not unkind, reminded her sharply of her own childhood, of the particular ache of wanting a thing badly enough that hoping for it felt dangerous. She told Caleb, finally, that she would stay, though she made clear, with the same plain honesty he had offered her, that she would not be rushed into anything, that whatever grew between them would have to grow honestly or not at all. The weeks that followed were not without their difficulties. Silver Creek, like most small towns, had a long memory for gossip and a considerable appetite for repeating it, and Eleanor found herself, in those early days, the subject of a great deal of unkind speculation, some of it about the scarring on her face, more of it about the peculiar circumstances of her arrival and the swiftness with which the widower Whitfield had stepped in where the Kane brothers had so publicly failed. Reginald Kane, for his part, offered no apology, and Thomas, when he finally learned what his brother had done in his absence, was too mortified and too slow to act to salvage whatever might have grown between himself and Eleanor had their correspondence continued honestly. Eleanor found she did not much mourn what had been lost there. Whatever fragile hope she had carried west toward Thomas Kane had been built on letters and imagination, while what was building now, slowly and carefully, between herself and Caleb Whitfield's small household, was built on something considerably more solid. She moved into a small room in town at first, taking in mending and doing what work she could find, while spending her afternoons out at the Whitfield ranch, initially under the polite fiction of helping with the twins while Caleb attended to the ranch's demanding work. Mary and Grace, cautious at first the way children who have lost a mother often are with any woman who might be asked to fill that space, warmed to her slowly, drawn in by her patience, by the quiet, steady way she answered their endless questions, by her willingness to sit on the porch in the evenings and tell them stories rather than simply managing them the way a hired hand might. Eleanor found, to her own quiet surprise, that the ache she had carried for years, the particular loneliness of being a woman the world had decided was not worth the trouble of loving, began to soften in the presence of 2 children who asked nothing of her except that she stay, and a man who watched her with the twins each evening with an expression that had, by slow degrees, stopped being merely grateful and started becoming something considerably warmer. It was Grace, the quieter of the 2 twins, who put words to what had been building for months, asking Eleanor directly one evening, with a blunt honesty only a child that age can manage, whether she intended to become their mother properly, with a wedding and everything, or whether she was simply going to keep coming and going the way she had been. Eleanor, caught without a ready answer, found herself looking toward Caleb, who had come out onto the porch in time to hear the question and who did not, this time, hesitate the way he had at the depot months before. He told his daughters and Eleanor that he had been waiting for the right moment to ask a question of his own, and that Grace had simply beaten him to raising the subject. He asked Eleanor, there on the porch with his daughters watching with undisguised hope, whether she would marry him properly, not out of the practical arrangement that had first brought them together, but because he had come, over the months since that difficult afternoon at the depot, to genuinely and deeply love her, scar and all, or rather without the scar ever having mattered to him in the first place. Eleanor married Caleb Whitfield that autumn, in a small ceremony at the ranch with Mary and Grace as her flower girls, insisting on flowers gathered from the ranch's own fields rather than anything ordered in from town, and the town of Silver Creek, whatever its earlier appetite for gossip, largely came around, in the months and years that followed, to a grudging and then genuine fondness for the woman who had arrived on their platform to public humiliation and had built, in its place, one of the steadiest and happiest households in the valley. Reginald Kane, for his part, found himself the subject of a different kind of talk in the years that followed, the sort reserved for men whose cruelty had become, through no effort of Eleanor's own, a cautionary tale told to newcomers about the dangers of judging a person by a first glance at the depot platform. Eleanor herself rarely spoke of that afternoon at all, except sometimes, on quiet evenings, to remind Mary and Grace, now growing into young women themselves, that the worst moment of her life had turned out, through no design of her own, to be the very doorway into the best one, and that a person's worth had never once, in the whole history of the world, been properly measured by the first thing a stranger noticed about their face.